I want to start this video with a confession. I almost didn't make it. Parts 1, 2, and 3 of this series were, in a sense, easier to make. India's economic rise, the China rivalry, the tech revolution. Big, sweeping, mostly positive stories. Stories that powerful people want told. Stories that fit neatly into the narrative that Western governments, Western investors, and Western media have largely agreed to tell about India. If you've missed any of the earlier parts, you'll find all the links in the description and in the pinned comment below. And once you've watched this video, I'd really like to hear your thoughts, so please share your perspective in the comments. India is the good rising power, democratic, English-speaking, aligned with our values, the counterweight to authoritarian China, partner, not threat. The story we've all agreed on. This video is about the parts of that story that get left out, the inconvenient parts, the parts that complicate the clean narrative, the parts that, if you take them seriously, force you to ask questions that nobody in a position of power seems to want answered. I'm Kaiyu Jin, economist at the London School of Economics, born in Beijing, 1983. I've spent 2 decades studying how rising powers manage and mismanage their internal contradictions. I watched China sacrifice political freedom for economic growth and call it a success. I watched the West applaud that sacrifice as long as the factories kept running. And now I'm watching something similar happen with India. Not identical. India is genuinely different from China in important ways. But the pattern of the West choosing strategic convenience over honest assessment of democratic backsliding, that pattern I recognize. I lived through it once. I'm watching it happen again. Before we go further, links to parts 1 through 3 are in the description. This video stands alone, but makes more sense with the context of what came before. Because the point is not that India is failing. The point is that the same forces driving India's extraordinary rise are generating internal pressures that a democracy, any democracy, struggles to absorb. The part nobody wanted me to make. Let me tell you about a conversation I had in New Delhi in 2024. I was there for a conference on Asian economic development. One evening, dinner with a small group. Indian economists, journalists, academics. Smart people. Accomplished people. People who've been watching their country change for decades. At some point, the conversation turned to the political climate, and something shifted in the room. Voices dropped. Someone glanced at the door. Another person made a small gesture, subtle, the kind you only notice if you're watching for it, that meant not here, not loudly. These were not dissidents. These were mainstream Indian intellectuals. Professors at major universities, writers whose work appears in respected publications, and they were self-censoring, audibly, visibly, not from paranoia, but from calculation, from understanding exactly where the line was and choosing not to cross it in mixed company. I've had that same experience in Beijing. I know what it looks like. I know what it means. And sitting in that restaurant in New Delhi, I felt something I wasn't expecting. Not outrage, sadness. Because India is supposed to be different. India was built to be different. The freedom of speech, the press freedom, the independent judiciary, the opposition parties, the raucous, chaotic, magnificent democracy that Nehru and Ambedkar and Gandhi built from the wreckage of colonialism. That was supposed to be India's defining difference from every other rising power in history. And it is under pressure, real, sustained, structural pressure, in ways that the West is systematically choosing not to see. What Modi's India actually looks like, I want to be precise here because imprecision is dangerous in this conversation. Narendra Modi is not a dictator. India is not an authoritarian state. Elections are held. Opposition parties exist and win at the state level. Courts still issue rulings that challenge the government. Journalists still publish critical stories. The institutions of Indian democracy are functioning, but they are functioning under strain. And the direction of travel, the consistent, sustained, years-long direction of travel, is toward concentration of power, narrowing of dissent, and the hardening of a particular vision of what India is and who it belongs to. Let me give you the concrete facts, because this conversation requires facts, not impressions. Press Freedom Index 2024. India ranks 159th out of 180 countries, below Pakistan, below Afghanistan before the Taliban takeover, below every country in the European Union by a distance, below every country in North America, below most of Africa. The Reporters Without Borders assessment cites the concentration of media ownership in the hands of conglomerates with close ties to the ruling party, the harassment of journalists who report critically on the government, the use of sedition laws, tax raids, and regulatory action as tools to pressure independent outlets. Freedom House 2024. India is rated partly free, not free, partly free. That designation, which India shares with countries like Kenya and Ecuador, reflects concerns about the independence of the judiciary, the treatment of minorities, the space for civil society, and the conduct of elections, including the use of state resources to benefit the ruling party. VDEM Institute, the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg, one of the most rigorous academic measures of democratic quality, classifies India as an electoral autocracy. That phrase, electoral autocracy, means a country that holds elections, but in which the conditions for genuine democratic competition are significantly compromised. The same classification applies to Hungary, Turkey, and El Salvador. These are not fringe assessments. These are the outputs of respected, mainstream, academic, and journalistic institutions, and they have been deteriorating consistently for a decade. The BJP's rise and what it represents. To understand what is happening to Indian democracy, you have to understand what the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, represents ideologically. Because the party is not just a political organization. It is the electoral expression of a much older ideological movement, the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, founded in 1925, a Hindu nationalist organization, paramilitary in its early structure, ideologically committed to the concept of Hindutva, Hindu nationhood, the idea that India is fundamentally a Hindu civilization and that its national identity should reflect that. Modi is a lifelong RSS member. He joined as a child, was trained by the organization, rose through its ranks. The BJP is the political arm of the RSS. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is openly acknowledged by the party and the organization. The RSS has over 5 million members. It runs thousands of schools, charities, cultural organizations. It is the largest civil society organization in India. And its ideology, Hindutva, has moved from the fringe of Indian political life to its center over the past decade. What does Hindutva actually mean in practice? At its most benign, it means emphasizing India's Hindu heritage and culture, renaming cities, rebuilding temples, celebrating Hindu festivals as national events. These things are culturally significant, but not inherently threatening. At its least benign, it means treating India's 200 million Muslims as outsiders, as a fifth column, as people whose loyalties are suspect and whose citizenship is conditional. It means cow vigilante violence, where Hindu mobs attack, beat, and sometimes kill Muslims suspected of slaughtering cows, with minimal police intervention and sometimes active protection. It means the bulldozer justice, where state governments demolish the homes and businesses of Muslim residents following communal tensions, without court orders, as collective punishment. Both of these things are happening in India simultaneously. The benign cultural nationalism and the violent discriminatory edge. And a government that emphasizes the former while tolerating and sometimes encouraging the latter. the Hindu-Muslim fault line. India has 200 million Muslims, the world's third largest Muslim population after Indonesia and Pakistan. They have been part of Indian civilization for over 1,000 years. They built the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, the Qutb Minar. They produced poets and philosophers and mathematicians who are foundational to Indian intellectual heritage. And they are increasingly living as a threatened minority in the country they have inhabited for centuries. I want to tell you about a statistic that doesn't get enough attention. In 2020, the Pew Research Center published a major survey on religion in India. Among its findings, 64% of Hindus said that being Hindu was very important to being truly Indian. 65% said that speaking Hindi was very important to being truly Indian. These numbers seem innocuous until you remember that India's Muslims have been Indian for as long as there has been in India, and that a majority of them are not native Hindi speakers. The survey was a window into a transformation of Indian identity politics. The BJP has been systematically defining Indianness in terms that implicitly exclude Muslims. Not always explicitly, not always with direct discrimination, but through the accumulation of signals, policies, rhetoric, and violence that communicates to the Muslim community. You are tolerated here, not welcomed. The Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019. This law granted accelerated citizenship to refugees from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan if they were Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, or Christian. It explicitly excluded Muslims. The government's stated justification was that Muslims in those countries faced no religious persecution and therefore didn't need the same protection. The actual effect was to create a formal, legal distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim migrants. For the first time in Indian history, religion became a criterion for citizenship eligibility. The National Register of Citizens in Assam. In the northeastern state of Assam, the government conducted a citizen verification exercise that required residents to prove their citizenship going back decades. 2 million people, a disproportionate number of them Muslim, were left off the register, rendered stateless in a country where many of them had lived for generations. The Supreme Court is still hearing challenges. The Kashmir lockdown. In 2019, the government revoked the special constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir, India's only Muslim-majority state. They arrested thousands of people, including elected politicians. They shut down the internet, which remained partially suspended for nearly 2 years, the longest internet shutdown in a democracy in history. They detained people without charge under the Public Safety Act, a law that allows detention for up to 2 years without trial. These are not isolated incidents. They are a pattern. A decade-long pattern of policies that systematically diminish the citizenship rights, economic security, and physical safety of Indian Muslims. I am not saying this to be anti-India. I love India. I've spent time there. I have Indian colleagues whose brilliance and humanity are unquestionable. I am saying this because it is true, and because the consequences of ignoring it are serious. The caste system that modernity hasn't fixed. Now let me turn to something even older and even more resistant to change, something that Ambedkar, the architect of India's constitution and himself a Dalit, spent his entire life fighting, something that Nehru called India's greatest shame, something that is still, in the second decade of the 21st century, shaping the life chances of hundreds of millions of Indians in ways that no amount of GDP growth has yet dismantled. Caste. Let me give you the basic structure for those unfamiliar. The Hindu caste system divides society into 4 main varnas: Brahmins, the priestly and scholarly class; Kshatriyas, the warrior and ruling class; Vaishyas, the merchant class; Shudras, the laboring class. And below all of these, outside the system entirely, the Dalits, previously called untouchables, the people assigned the most degrading work. the people whose touch, whose shadow, whose presence at a well or a temple was considered polluting. The Indian Constitution of 1950 abolished untouchability. It established reservations, affirmative action quotas, in government jobs and educational institutions. It created the legal framework for caste equality. Ambedkar, who drafted the Constitution, knew that legal equality was the beginning, not the end. He knew that 3,000 years of social hierarchy do not dissolve because a document says they must. He was right. In 2025, Dalits comprise 17% of India's population, over 200 million people. They are still, in large parts of rural India, denied access to the same wells as upper caste Hindus. Their children are still seated separately in village schools in some states. They are still the victims of caste-based atrocities, beatings, rapes, murders, at rates that official statistics capture incompletely and the national media covers minimally. The National Crime Records Bureau of India reports around 50,000 crimes against Dalits annually. That number is almost certainly an undercount, because most crimes go unreported due to fear of retaliation and distrust of police, who are disproportionately upper caste. But here is a dimension that matters for India's economic future specifically. Caste is an economic system. It is a system for restricting who can do what work, who can access which networks, who can accumulate capital. For 3,000 years, it prevented Dalits from entering most professions, owning property, accessing education. The formal abolition of these restrictions in 1950 created legal rights. It did not create equal starting positions. India's extraordinary economic growth of the past 30 years has not been caste neutral. The industries that drove growth, IT services, financial services, e-commerce, pharmaceutical manufacturing, they are disproportionately staffed and owned by upper caste Hindus. The networks that direct investment, mentorship, opportunity in India's startup ecosystem are largely caste networks, even when nobody acknowledges them as such. The reservation system helps. It has created a Dalit professional class, a Dalit middle class, Dalit politicians and civil servants and academics. But it covers government and public sector employment. The private sector has no mandatory reservations, and the private sector is where India's growth is increasingly concentrated. The economic rise I described in parts 1 through 3, the manufacturing surge, the tech revolution, the growing middle class, it is real, and it is happening in ways that are reproducing, not dissolving, ancient hierarchies. The Dalit farmer getting a UPI account is better off than before. The Dalit graduate who cannot get a call back from a startup because the founders went to the same upper caste-dominated IIT network and hire through those networks is participating in a growth story that is not fully his. India cannot become a true superpower while carrying this weight. Economic growth without social equity is politically unstable. The history of countries that tried it is not encouraging. The press and the shrinking space. In part 3, I talked about India's technology ecosystem with considerable admiration, the innovations, the startups, the AI development, and that admiration was genuine. But there is a technology the Indian government has been deploying that I did not cover: surveillance technology. The Pegasus spyware scandal. In 2021, the Pegasus Project, a consortium of international journalists, revealed that NSO Group's Pegasus spyware had been used to target the phones of journalists, opposition politicians, activists, and lawyers in India. The Indian government denied purchasing or deploying Pegasus. Technical forensic analysis confirmed infections on specific devices. The Supreme Court ordered an investigation. The committee reported finding no conclusive evidence. The question of who ordered the surveillance and why remains officially unanswered, but the effect is not. Journalists who cover the BJP critically know their phones may be compromised. They know the state has the technical capability to read their messages, track their movements, monitor their sources. Whether or not any specific device is infected at any specific moment, the awareness of surveillance capability changes behavior. It is the panopticon effect. You don't need to watch everyone all the time. You just need everyone to know they might be watched. The Wire, one of India's most important independent news outlets, has faced multiple defamation suits and an FIR, a criminal complaint, related to its investigative reporting. NewsClick, a digital news platform, had its offices raided by police in 2023. Its founders were arrested under anti-terrorism laws. The charges related to foreign funding that the government characterized as a Chinese disinformation operation. The journalists involved deny it. The courts are reviewing it. The effect on other journalists considering stories that might attract similar attention is immediate and chilling. NDTV, for years India's most prominent private news network, was effectively acquired by the Adani Group, a conglomerate with extraordinarily close ties to Modi. The founder and longtime editor resigned. The editorial direction changed. It is now part of a media landscape where the largest and most influential outlets are owned by business groups that depend on government approvals, regulatory decisions, and infrastructure contracts. The structural incentive for self-censorship is not subtle. I am not saying the Indian government controls the media the way China controls the media. It does not. Critical journalism continues. Opposition voices exist. This video itself can be watched in India without a VPN. These distinctions matter, but the direction, the sustained direction over a decade, is toward a media environment where critical reporting carries real, personal, and professional risk, where the ecosystem of incentives pushes toward accommodation, where the space for independent journalism is measurably smaller than it was 10 years ago. The farmers, the protests, the silence after. In November 2020, Indian farmers began a protest that would become one of the largest in human history. Hundreds of thousands of farmers, predominantly from Punjab and Haryana, camped on the roads leading into Delhi for over a year. They were protesting 3 farm laws passed by the Modi government that they argued would corporatize agriculture and destroy the minimum support price system that guaranteed them a baseline income. The government initially refused to negotiate meaningfully. Then, it deployed water cannons and tear gas against protesters. Then, it allowed internet shutdowns in protest areas. Then, it charged protest leaders under sedition and terrorism laws. Then, after over a year of protest and more than 700 farmer deaths from cold, illness, and accidents at the protest sites, the government repealed the laws. I want to think about what this episode reveals. First, that Indian democratic pressure can still work. The farmers organized, they sustained the pressure, they won. That is democracy functioning. Second, the tools the government used to resist that pressure before capitulating: internet shutdowns, sedition charges against protest organizers, the framing of the protest as a foreign-funded conspiracy, with Punjabi Canadian Sikhs apparently orchestrating sedition from Vancouver. These are not the tools of a confident democracy engaging with legitimate dissent. These are the tools of a government that views mass peaceful protest as a threat to be managed rather than a voice to be heard. Third, and most troubling, after the laws were repealed, after the farmers went home, the charges against protest leaders were not dropped. The individuals who organized peaceful protests that ultimately prevailed on the policy question remained under legal threat. The message to future protest organizers is clear. You might win on policy. You will still pay personally. What China's playbook tells us about India's temptation. I've spent a lot of this series drawing comparisons between India and China, usually to highlight differences. India is democratic, India is open, India's tech sector integrates with the world in ways China's cannot. India's foreign policy maintains independence that China's has sacrificed for predictability. All of that is still true, but I want to draw a different comparison now, not about where these two countries are, about the temptation they share. China's leadership looked at its extraordinary economic success and drew a conclusion. The success happened because of strong, centralized governance, because we were able to override resistance, because we didn't have to negotiate with opposition parties or an independent press or civil society organizations that might slow things down or complicate the message. The political system enabled the economic success. Loosen the political system, and you risk the economic success. This is the authoritarian bargain. Economic dynamism in exchange for political control. Growth in exchange for voice. I have watched, with increasing concern, the emergence of a version of this logic in India. Not stated explicitly, not acknowledged, but present in the pattern of decisions. The farm laws, passed without meaningful parliamentary consultation, without engagement with the affected communities, with confidence that the economic logic was correct and that democratic friction was an obstacle to implementation. The demonetization of 2016, the overnight elimination of 86% of India's currency, announced with 4 hours' notice, no consultation with the Reserve Bank of India's board, no preparation of the banking system, enormous economic disruption, primarily borne by the informal economy, the poor, the daily wage workers who operated in cash. The economic case for it was contested. The political case, disrupting the opposition's cash reserves before state elections, was not. The pattern is of a government that believes it knows what India needs, that views deliberation, consultation, and opposition as friction rather than as the legitimate functioning of democratic governance, that treats the mandate of electoral victory as permission to govern without ongoing accountability. This is not authoritarianism, but it is the disposition that, if sustained and strengthened, slides toward authoritarianism. And the question I keep asking is what happens when India's superpower ambitions meet the constraints of genuine democratic accountability? Because superpower ambition is expensive. It requires sacrifice. It requires some groups to bear costs so that the collective project can advance. In a democracy, the groups asked to bear costs get to vote. They get to organize. They get to say no. And when they say no loudly enough, policy changes, as the farmers demonstrated. The authoritarian temptation is to ask, wouldn't it be easier without all that friction? Wouldn't India rise faster if decisions could be made and implemented without the delay and compromise that democracy requires? China answered yes to that question. The answer has produced extraordinary economic growth and a society that is increasingly surveilled, censored, and controlled. India has not answered yes. But the question is being asked, and some of the answers coming from the current government suggest the temptation is real. The West's dangerous silence. Here is what makes me most frustrated. And I say this as someone who has spent 2 decades in Western academic and policy institutions. The West knows what I've just described: the press freedom rankings, the minority rights concerns, the democratic backsliding indicators. This is not hidden information. It is published by respected Western institutions. Freedom House is American. VDEM is European. Reporters Without Borders is French. These are not anti-India organizations. They are organizations that apply consistent methodologies across all countries and report what they find. And the Western government's response to these findings, when it comes to India, is essentially silence. Strategic silence. Deliberate silence. Silence that reflects a calculation. India is too important as a counterweight to China to risk the relationship with honest criticism. The Biden administration, which talked constantly about the alliance of democracies, hosted Modi with full honors. Asked about press freedom and minority rights, administration officials gave careful, diplomatic non-answers. The Modi government, they noted, is democratically elected. India is a sovereign nation. They are a valued partner. The United Kingdom, post-Brexit, desperate for trade deals, signed a comprehensive trade agreement with India in 2022. The human rights provisions were minimal. The critical commentary was muted. The European Union, which lectures developing countries routinely about democratic standards and rule of law as conditions for trade and aid, treats India with a different standard. Because India is big. Because India is strategically important. Because India is not China. I understand the strategic logic. I disagree with the policy conclusion. Because there is a version of this story that ends very badly. A version where India's democratic institutions continue to weaken while the West stays silent because of strategic interests. Where the Hindu-Muslim tensions continue to escalate. Where press freedom continues to decline. Where the space for dissent continues to narrow. Until the point where the deterioration is irreversible. And then the West wakes up and realizes it has spent a decade investing in a partner whose values it claimed to share, while those values were being systematically dismantled. This has happened before. The West's relationship with authoritarian-leaning partners in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia. The pattern is consistent. Strategic silence in the short term, instability, crisis, and regret in the long term. Honest engagement is not anti-India. It is pro-India. It says, we take your democracy seriously enough to hold it to the standards you yourself enshrined in your constitution. We take your relationship with us seriously enough to tell you the truth rather than what is convenient. Can democracy survive superpower ambition? Let me bring this to the central question, the question that everything in this series has been building toward. India's superpower ambitions are real and largely achievable. The demographics, the manufacturing, the technology, the geopolitical positioning, all of it points toward a country that will be among the most powerful on Earth by 2050. But India's path to that power runs through a political system that is showing cracks. And the cracks are not incidental to the rise. They are, in some ways, produced by it. Rapid economic growth creates winners and losers. In India, the winners are disproportionately urban, educated, upper caste, Hindu. The losers are disproportionately rural, less educated, lower caste, and Muslim. The political energy of the losers, if it cannot find expression through democratic channels, finds expression through other means, through identity politics, through communal violence, through the kind of grievance mobilization that the BJP has been extremely skilled at converting into electoral support. The paradox of India's current moment is this. The BJP has won elections partly by channeling the resentment of people who have not fully shared in India's growth. But the BJP's governance, its concentration of power, its treatment of minorities, its relationship with big capital, is accelerating the conditions that produce that resentment. It is a political machine that runs on grievance while making the grievances worse. This is not sustainable, not economically, not politically, not socially. The historians of future decades will have to grapple with a profound question about this period in Indian history. Was the democratic backsliding a manageable phase that India passed through on its way to superpower status, the way South Korea passed through military dictatorship on its way to democratic prosperity? Or was it the beginning of a more permanent transformation, a Faustian bargain where economic growth was purchased with the sacrifice of the democratic institutions that made India worth becoming powerful in the first place? I don't know the answer. Nobody does. History hasn't decided yet. The decisions being made right now in New Delhi, in state capitals, in village councils and courtrooms and editorial meetings across India. Those decisions are writing the answer, the hardest question. I want to end with what I believe is the hardest question in all of geopolitics right now. Harder than what China will do about Taiwan. Harder than whether the US-China rivalry ends in conflict or accommodation. Harder than any of the questions I addressed in the first 3 parts of this series. The question is this: what is Indian democracy for? Is it a means to an end? A mechanism for managing a diverse country of 1.4 billion people through the difficult transition to modernity and power? A system valuable because it produces stability, legitimacy, and growth? In which case it can be trimmed, adjusted, concentrated, made more efficient, as long as it keeps producing those outcomes? Or is it an end in itself? A commitment to the equal dignity of every Indian citizen, regardless of caste or religion or language. A promise made by the founders that India would be a place where power derived from the people and was accountable to the people and was constrained by the rights of the people. In which case, no amount of GDP growth, no strategic partnership with the West, no geopolitical ambition justifies compromising it. I know which answer Ambedkar would give. He gave it repeatedly. He said that political democracy without social democracy was a building constructed on a foundation of sand. He said that liberty, equality, and fraternity were not 3 separate things, but a union, that you could not have one without the others. He warned, specifically and prophetically, about the danger of hero worship in Indian politics, about the tendency to place faith in a great leader rather than in institutions. The question of what Indian democracy is for is not for me to answer. I am not Indian. I did not inherit the founding promise. It is for 1.4 billion Indians to answer, through their choices, their votes, their protests, their journalism, their courts, their daily lives. But I can say this: the answer matters to everyone, not just Indians. Because the argument that democracy can compete with authoritarianism at scale, that you don't have to sacrifice freedom for growth, that the future doesn't have to be Chinese-style managed capitalism, that argument lives or dies with India. If India builds a genuine democracy that delivers prosperity and dignity for 1.4 billion people, including its 200 million Muslims and its 200 million Dalits, and every other group that has historically been on the wrong side of Indian power, it proves something the 21st century desperately needs to believe: that the other way is possible. If India's democracy hollows out, if it becomes the electoral facade that China's critics accused it of being all along, if the caste hierarchies and religious divisions that the founders hoped modernity would dissolve instead harden into permanent features of a powerful but deeply unequal society, then the argument is lost, and the 21st century becomes, by default, the Chinese century. That is not what I want. That is not what the founders of India wanted. That is not what hundreds of millions of ordinary Indians, who turn out in their hundreds of millions to vote in the most extraordinary democratic exercise in human history, want either. India's rise is real. India's democracy is real. And the tension between them is the most important political story of our time. The outcome is not decided. It is being decided. Right now, in ways that deserve far more attention than the West is currently paying. This is not the end of the India series. It's the most important part of it.